To understand the fleet of black vehicles that arrived at the end of that dusty section road on the morning of September 19th, 2026, you first have to understand the silence they were breaking. It was a quiet born of emptiness. The Henderson Place, a mile to the east, was already vacant, its windows staring out like vacant eyes. The Garcia farm, 2 miles north, was the same, the swing set in the yard unnervingly still. For weeks, a corporate entity called AgriVast Holdings had moved through the flatlands of Sherman County, a patient and well-funded phantom armed with cashier's checks and satellite maps, buying up the family farms one by one. They bought the land, the houses, the barns, the grain bins, and the generational histories that came with them. They bought it all, leaving behind a profound and spreading silence. Greta was the last one. Her farm sat at the terminus of the road, a modest 2-story house, a gambrel-roofed barn, and a line of Siberian elms that served as a windbreak against the ceaseless prairie wind. She was the final parcel, the last holdout, the one stubborn square on their digital map that refused to change color from family-owned to corporate asset. The assumption, whispered at the grain co-op before it too sold out, was that she was just being difficult. That she was an old soul in a young body, clinging to sentiment. The men from AgriVast were not worried. Their representative, a sharp young man named Preston, had assured his superiors it was only a matter of time. But on that September morning, the mood was different. The vehicles crunched to a halt in a cloud of pale dust, and when the doors opened, it was not just Preston who emerged. He was flanked by 2 older men in severe suits, their city shoes ill-suited for the dry. Cracked earth of the farmyard, their faces were grim, tight with a tension that felt utterly alien to the landscape. They weren't carrying a checkbook or a final offer. They were carrying briefcases and a look of barely concealed panic. They didn't approach the front door with the easy confidence of buyers who held all the cards. They approached it like supplicants. They had come to ask Greta not for her land, but for her memory, and to understand how a multi-billion-dollar corporation had been brought to its knees by a quiet woman in a faded farmhouse. You have to go back 12 years, to a cold afternoon in the loft of the old barn, to the moment the whole story really began. The year was 2014. Greta was 20, home from her first year of college, not because she wanted to be, but because her grandfather had passed. The funeral was over, the last of the casseroles had been eaten, and the family was gathered in the kitchen, ostensibly to sort through his effects, but really to argue about the future. Her father, Roy, a good man worn down by decades of drought and debt, paced the linoleum floor. Her younger brother, Eli, 17 and buzzing with the frictionless logic of youth, was tapping impatiently at a tablet. The subject was the farm, as it always was. But now, with the patriarch gone, the conversation had a new and terrifying urgency. Roy saw salvation in a consolidation loan, a new line of credit that would allow them to invest in the latest GPS-guided planters and automated irrigation systems. Eli, who saw the farm not as a legacy, but as a data set to be optimized, was arguing for leasing their acreage to a larger corporate farm. It was the smart play, he said, the only way to de-risk their position. It was a conversation happening in kitchens all across the Great Plains. Greta was silent, staring out the window at the barn. Her grandfather had been a man of the old way, He had farmed with his father, who had farmed with his father before him, on land broken from the prairie sod by a homesteader ancestor. He had trusted the sky, the soil, and the things he could write down with his own hand. In his final years, as the world moved online, he had become more and more insistent on his old methods, a trait the family saw as stubbornness, a harmless eccentricity. His last instruction to Greta, whispered in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, had not been about the land or the money. It had been about the barn. "Don't let them throw it out," he had said, his voice a dry rasp. "It's all that's real." She finally spoke, her voice cutting through the argument. "I'm not going back to school. I'm staying here." Roy stopped pacing. Eli looked up from his screen, annoyed. "Greta, be serious. The Ag Science program is the only thing that can save this place." Her father agreed. "He's right. There's nothing for you here right now but work and worry. Grandpa asked me to look after the archive," she said simply. Eli snorted. "The archive? You mean those dusty boxes of junk in the barn loft? Dad, it's a fire hazard. We need to have a shredding party and be done with it. Everything that matters is filed digitally with the county clerk." Roy sighed, the weight of his father's old-fashioned ways and his children's conflicting futures pressing down on him. "Your brother's right, honey, it's all just sentiment. The real deeds, the real titles, they're all online now, safe and sound on the county servers." Greta stood up, her jaw set. "No," she said, and the word was so firm, so final, that both men fell silent. "He said it was all that's real. I'm going to take care of it." That afternoon, she moved out of the house and into the small, dusty apartment her grandfather had built into the barn loft, next to the room that housed his life's work. The decision cleaved the family. To her father, it was a profound disappointment, a daughter choosing a dusty past over a bright future. To her brother, it was proof that she was impractical and hopelessly nostalgic. To Greta, it was the keeping of a promise, the beginning of a long and solitary vigil. Let me tell you about the archive, because it's where the story really lives. To call it a collection of records was to miss the point entirely. It was a library of place, a physical biography of every acre her family had ever touched. Eli was right that it was dusty, and Roy was right that it seemed obsolete. But they were both wrong about what it was. It wasn't junk. It was the source code of the landscape. The room was in the north end of the barn loft, walled off and insulated, with a single, deep-set window facing the house. The air inside was cool and smelled of old paper, leather, and dry cedar. Rows of tall wooden shelves lined the walls, sagging slightly under the weight of their cargo. There were thick, leather-bound ledgers with marbled end papers, their spines embossed with faded gold-leaf titles: Rainfall 1890-1920, Seed Trials 1933, Cattle Sales 1951-1975. In them, her ancestors had recorded not just numbers, but observations. June 7, 1911, one entry read in elegant cursive: Hail came from the northwest, stripped the corn bare. The new wheat from Russia held on. Thank the Lord. It was data, yes, but it was data with a soul. There were tall, narrow drawers filled with maps. Not satellite printouts or GIS plots, but plat maps drawn by hand on waxed linen, The ink faded from black to a soft brown. They showed property lines marked not by GPS coordinates, but by witness posts. The large Sioux quartzite boulder on the creek bend, the triple-trunk cottonwood, the iron axle driven by my father in '02. These were maps that required you to walk the land to understand them. They were a conversation between the cartographer and the earth itself. And there were the boxes. Dozens of archival grade, acid-free boxes, each meticulously labeled in her grandfather's shaky hand. Inside were the documents that the modern world had tried so hard to render irrelevant. Original homestead patents, signed by the territorial governor. Water rights decrees from court cases, settled a century ago. The paper brittle and sealed with a crumbling wax press. Mineral rights leases typed on onion skin paper. Handshake agreements for fence lines and grazing access, witnessed and signed by neighbors long since passed away. Their signatures a testament to a time when a person's word was their bond, but they wrote it down, just in case. Her grandfather's philosophy, which she now adopted as her own, was simple. He believed that the land was a living thing, with a memory that far outlasted any human or any machine. The digital record, stored on a county server miles away, was an abstraction. It was a ghost, a flicker of light on a screen. It had no weight, no texture, no history. It could be altered with a keystroke. It could be erased by a power surge or a hacker. It was, in his words, a convenient fiction. The archive, however, was real. You could hold the deed in your hand, feel the weight of the paper, see the signature of the person who had first claimed that land from the wild prairie. It was tangible. It was proof. The world, of course, had moved on. The county clerk's office had spent a fortune in the early 2000s digitizing everything. Every deed, every mortgage, every easement, every survey was scanned and entered into a state-of-the-art database, secured with the latest encryption, and backed up to a remote server. The paper originals were offered back to the landowners. Most, seeing them as bulky and useless, had them shredded. Her grandfather had been one of the very few who had driven his old pickup truck to the county seat and loaded every last piece of paper connected to his family's land, and that of many of his neighbors who couldn't be bothered. He was saving more than just his own history. He was unknowingly building an ark. To everyone else, Greta's project was a sad joke. The other farmers in the area, men like Henderson and Garcia, were all in on the new system. They managed their farms from their tablets, tracking yields, moisture levels, and commodity prices in real time. Their titles were secured on the blockchain. They could execute a land sale from their kitchen table with a few clicks. They saw Greta spending her days in a dusty barn loft as a tragic figure, a young woman who had turned her back on progress to worship at the altar of nostalgia. They called her archive Greta's Museum, and they did not mean it as a compliment. It was dead weight, they said, a monument to a past that was best forgotten. For 12 years, that barn loft was Greta's entire world. The period of incubation began not with grand ambition, but with simple sorting. She took her grandfather's chaotic but functional system and imposed upon it a librarian's order. She bought books on archival preservation, learning about humidity control, the dangers of acid migration in paper, and the proper way to handle fragile documents. She spent a small inheritance, not on a new car or a trip, but on archival quality boxes, mylar sleeves, and a heavy-duty dehumidifier that hummed day and night, keeping the prairie's dampness at bay. Her days fell into a quiet, methodical rhythm. In the mornings, she would work on the farm itself, doing just enough to keep the place from falling into ruin. She mended fences, patched the barn roof, and tended a small garden. But her real work began in the afternoon, when she would climb the steep wooden stairs to the loft. The work was slow, painstaking, and invisible to the outside world. She would take a single ledger, page by page, and gently clean the paper with a soft brush. Where the ink had faded, she would study it under a magnifying glass, sometimes spending an hour deciphering a single word. She taught herself the lost art of iron gall ink preparation, not to alter the records, but to understand how they were made, how they aged, how they decayed. She moved from the ledgers to the maps. This was the work that took her out onto the land. She would take one of the old linen plat maps, a compass, and a measuring chain, and she would walk. She walked the fence lines, searching for the physical markers described in the cursive notes. She found the Sioux quartzite boulder, now half buried in the silt of the creek bed, its distinctive pink hue unmistakable. She found the stump of the triple-trunk cottonwood, long dead, but still a landmark. She found the iron axle, a piece of a long-gone wagon, driven into the earth over a century before, its top rusted into a perfect, silent orange circle against the prairie grass. With each discovery, the land began to speak to her. The abstract lines on the map became real, tangible boundaries with stories attached. She learned that the odd jog in the northern fence line was there to accommodate a neighbor's access to the creek for his cattle, a handshake deal made in 1922 and recorded on the back of a map. She discovered a long-forgotten easement for a rural telephone line that had been defunct since the 1960s, a legal right-of-way that still technically existed. She found the original survey notes for the county road, revealing that its true right-of-way was 10 feet narrower than the modern county maps showed. The farm wasn't just a square of property. It was a complex tapestry of rights, responsibilities, and relationships, written in paper and etched into the earth. Her family watched this with a mixture of pity and frustration. Eli went off to the state university and earned a degree in agricultural technology. He would come home for holidays, full of talk about drone-based soil analysis and algorithmic crop rotation. He would see Greta's ink-stained fingers and sigh. "Greta, this is a hobby," he told her one Christmas. "A really weird, dusty hobby." AgriVast is leasing the old Henderson place. They're using satellite imagery to predict yields with 98% accuracy. And you're out looking for rusty axles. Don't you see how far behind you're falling? Roy, her father, was more gentle but no less concerned. He saw his daughter, bright and capable, devoting her youth to a dead language. He saw the farm's finances dwindling, the equipment aging. "I just don't understand what you think you're going to accomplish," he'd say, his voice full of a weary love. "Your grandfather was a good man, but he was stuck in the past. This isn't his world anymore." Each time, Greta would simply nod, unwilling to argue. How could she explain that she wasn't living in the past, but preserving a truth she felt, in her bones, would one day be necessary again? How could she explain that the rust on that axle felt more real, more permanent, than any pixel on her brother's tablet. So she worked on, in silence, curating her hidden asset, building her library of truth, waiting for a future she couldn't predict, but somehow knew was coming. The future arrived in the summer of 2026, in the form of a man named Preston. He was the lead acquisitions agent for AgriVast Holdings, a private equity firm that had identified Sherman County as a prime target for agricultural consolidation. Their plan was simple and brutal: buy up tens of thousands of acres of contiguous family farms, erase the old property lines, and create a single, massive, hyper-efficient mega-farm, managed by AI and worked by autonomous machinery. Preston was the face of this plan, and he was very, very good at his job. He was young, sharp, and exuded an unshakable confidence. He wore tailored shirts and expensive boots, and he drove a luxury pickup truck that had never known a muddy field. He arrived not with threats or lowball offers, but with overwhelming generosity. He carried an iPad that displayed beautiful, color-coded maps of the area, showing each farm's valuation calculated by a proprietary algorithm. The offers he made were often double the market rate, life-changing sums of money for families who had been struggling for years. He bought the Hendersons out on a Monday. They had been trying to sell for years with no takers. Preston's offer was a miracle. They signed without a second thought. He bought the Garcias out on Wednesday. They had wanted their kids to take over the farm, but the kids wanted lives in the city. Preston's check was their permission slip to let the dream die. One by one, the families that had held on for generations took the money. They were tired of the droughts, the floods, the volatile markets, the relentless pressure. AgriVast wasn't an enemy. It was an exit ramp. Roy and Eli saw it the same way. The offer Preston made for their land was staggering. It was enough to pay off every debt, set Roy up for a comfortable retirement, and bankroll whatever tech startup Eli wanted to launch. The pressure on Greta was immense. Family meetings became interventions. "It's the deal of a lifetime, Greta," Eli pleaded, his voice sharp with frustration. "This is our one chance to get out from under, and you're letting it slip away because of some sentimental junk in the barn." Her father's approach was softer, but it cut deeper. "Your grandfather wouldn't have wanted to see you struggle," Roy said, his eyes filled with worry. "He would have wanted you to be secure. Please, just talk to the man." So she agreed to talk to him. Preston arrived at her door on a hot afternoon in August, the iPad tucked under his arm. He was polite, professional, and utterly dismissive. He sat at her kitchen table and swiped through the glossy presentation, a blur of charts, graphs, and projected returns. He spoke of synergy, of economies of scale, of optimizing land use for maximum yield. It was a language completely disconnected from the smell of the soil or the sound of the wind in the elms. Greta listened patiently. When he was finished, she didn't speak of money or sentiment. She spoke of the archive. She told him about the Water Rights Decree of 1911, which limited irrigation from the creek during dry years. She told him about the unrecorded grazing easement the Garcias' great-grandfather had granted her own, a right that technically still existed. She told him about the true, narrower right-of-way for the county road. Preston smiled a thin, condescending smile. He tapped his iPad. "Ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with the patience one uses for a child. "I appreciate the history lesson. It's quaint, but all the legally binding data, the deeds, the easements, the rights of way, it's all been digitized and recorded on the county's servers. That's the single source of truth. These old papers," he waved a hand in the direction of the barn, "they're mementos. Family heirlooms. They have no legal standing anymore. They are, with all due respect, irrelevant." He slid a purchase agreement across the table, the final offer printed in bold at the bottom. The number was even higher than her father had said. It was a fortune. Greta looked at the paper, then back at him. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the small kitchen. "You don't own what you can't prove," she said, "and your proof is just electricity in a box 60 miles away." Preston's smile faded. He was no longer trying to be charming. "The system is secure, ma'am. It's backed up. It's infallible." "Nothing made by man is infallible," she replied. He stood up, collecting his device. His confidence had returned, now hardened into arrogance. "Look, the offer stands for 30 days. Frankly, we don't even need your parcel. We'll just build around you. So you can sit here with your mementos while the world's most advanced agricultural operation springs up on all sides. Your choice." He left without another word, confident that logic and the crushing weight of isolation would bring her around. He was sure he had won. The crisis came not with a bang, but with a quiet, digital whisper. On the first Tuesday of September, a day of clear skies and a steady wind from the south, it began. A clerk in the Sherman County Land Registry office clicked on an email attachment that looked like a shipping confirmation. That single, simple mistake unleashed a piece of malicious code so sophisticated, so virulent, that the county's IT department stood no chance. It was a new strain of ransomware, designed not just to encrypt data, but to hunt down and corrupt backups before making its presence known. By noon, every file on the county's main server was locked. The digital plat maps, the tax records, the deeds, the mortgages, everything was transformed into unusable gibberish. Panic set in. The IT director calmly initiated the backup protocol, connecting to the remote server where mirrored copies of all data were stored. The system reported back a catastrophic failure. The virus had done its job with terrifying efficiency. It had gotten to the backups first. The data wasn't just locked, it was gone. Decades of legally binding records, the entire digital bedrock of property ownership for 1,200 square miles of land, had vanished into the ether. For AgriVast Holdings, the news was an existential threat. They had spent hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring land based on those digital records. They had wire transfer confirmations and signed digital purchase agreements, but they suddenly had no legally verifiable proof of what exactly they had bought. They couldn't prove the precise boundaries of their new empire. They couldn't prove the extent of their water rights. They couldn't prove which mineral rights had transferred with the land and which had not. The multi-billion-dollar project ground to a halt. Their digital map was now just a pretty picture. The reality it was supposed to represent had been erased. The first sign of trouble for Greta was a frantic phone call from her father. His voice was thin with panic. They're saying the records are gone. All of them. The bank just called. They don't have the title for our mortgage anymore. Nobody knows who owns what. Eli called next, his usual tech bro confidence completely shattered. It's impossible, he kept stammering. The system had triple redundancy. This can't happen. But it had happened. The convenient fiction had been exposed for what it was. The infallible system had proven to be tragically, catastrophically fallible. The climax arrived on the morning of September 19th. The fleet of black SUVs was not a show of force, but an act of desperation. Preston emerged from his vehicle, his face pale, his expensive suit looking rumpled and out of place. The swagger was gone, replaced by the haunted look of a man who had seen his entire world dissolve. He and the two corporate lawyers from the head office walked up the path to the farmhouse where Greta was waiting on the porch, a mug of coffee in her hands. Preston stopped a few feet away, the lawyers hovering behind him like nervous shadows. He cleared his throat. "Miss," he began, his voice strained. "We have a problem. A significant data security breach at the county level." Greta took a slow sip of her coffee. "I heard," she said. He looked down at his city shoes, then back up at her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, pleading urgency. We need to see your records. We need to reconstruct the chain of title for our acquisitions. We need to know what we own." He gestured vaguely at the vast, silent landscape around them. "We need your maps, your deeds, your mementos." The last word came out as a choked whisper, the full weight of his previous dismissal crashing down upon him. It was the moment of quiet, profound vindication. But there was no triumph in Greta's eyes, no hint of "I told you so." Gloating was a waste of energy. The work was what mattered. She looked past Preston at the vast sweep of prairie her family had known for over a century. She thought of her grandfather, of the promise she had made. She finished her coffee and set the mug down on the porch railing. "You don't want to buy my land anymore," she stated. It wasn't a question. "No," Preston admitted, his voice barely audible. "We need to hire you. And your archive. We'll pay whatever you want. Name your price." Greta looked at him, then at the lawyers. For the first time she smiled, a small, knowing smile. "It's not for sale," she said. "But I will help you. On my terms." Her terms had nothing to do with money. They had to do with the land. The forgotten easements would be honored. The old water rights agreements would be reinstated. A portion of the new corporate farm would be set aside for regenerative grazing, according to notes she'd found in a ledger from the Dust Bowl years. AgriVast would not just own the land, they would be forced to know it. They would be forced to respect its memory. Defeated, and with no other option, they agreed to everything. Greta nodded once, then turned and walked toward the barn. "Come on then," she said over her shoulder. "The work begins now." The three men, emissaries of a broken digital empire, followed the quiet woman into the cool, dusty sanctuary of the archive, the only place where the truth was still real. In the aftermath, the world tilted on its axis in Sherman County. Greta's barn became the de facto land registry for the entire region. For months, a steady stream of people came to her door: lawyers, bankers, farmers who had sold, and farmers who had held out, all seeking the tangible proof of ownership that had been stored in her grandfather's careful hand. She became the arbiter of boundaries, the keeper of covenants, the one person whose records could untangle the digital knot that had ensnared them all. The AgriVast project was forced to transform. The grand vision of a perfectly uniform mega-farm, untroubled by the inconvenient history of property lines and water rights, was dead. Forced to honor the old agreements resurrected from the archive, they had to redesign their entire operation. They built around wetlands they never knew existed, honored fence lines that followed the contour of the land instead of a straight GPS line, and allocated water based on a handshake deal made a century before. Their efficiency dropped, but the resilience of their project, now tied to the realities of the landscape, increased tenfold. They had come to conquer the land, and instead they were forced into a partnership with it. The change within her own family was just as profound. Eli came home. He had quit his prestigious job with an ag-tech firm in the city. He arrived one afternoon, not with a tablet, but with a humble request. He stood before his sister in the loft of the barn, the scent of old paper all around them. "Can you teach me?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Can you teach me how to read this? I want to learn." He became her first and most devoted apprentice, trading his knowledge of code for the deeper knowledge of ink and linen, soil and memory. The line of succession was secured. Her father, Roy, found a peace he hadn't known in years. The worry that had etched deep lines into his face began to soften. He would often come and sit in the loft, not to help, but just to watch his two children working together, painstakingly restoring a faded map or cross referencing a water ledger. He finally understood. Greta hadn't been wasting her life clinging to the past. She had been guarding the future. The story of what happened in Sherman County became a quiet parable for the digital age. It revealed a fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of the modern world's obsession with data. Preston and AgriVast believed in their system. They believed that by converting the messy, complex reality of the land into clean, abstract data, they had perfected it. They had made it more efficient, more secure, more real than the physical world it was meant to represent. They saw the paper records in Greta's barn as a degraded copy, a sentimental echo of a superior digital original. But they had it backward. The digital record was the copy. It was the ghost. It was a brittle, fragile abstraction, vulnerable to a single mistake, a single line of bad code. The archive in the barn, the paper, the ink, the maps tied to physical stones and trees, the ledgers filled with the knowledge of human hands. That was the original. It was resilient. It was tangible. It had survived droughts, blizzards, and the Great Depression. And it easily survived a data breach that had brought a multi-billion-dollar corporation to its knees. What Greta had protected was not just a collection of old documents. She had protected the crucial difference between a database and a biography. A database is a collection of facts, stripped of context and soul. A biography is a story, rich with detail, nuance, and lived experience. AgriVast had tried to own a database. Greta understood that to truly inhabit a place, you had to know its biography. True ownership is not a transaction recorded on a server. It is a form of memory, a deep and abiding knowledge of a place's history, its limitations, and its truths. In an age that had chosen to forget, she had chosen to remember. And in the end, that memory proved to be the only thing of value left.